Need a little healing
And
today. I'm so excited.
thank you for having me again.
No. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Munson Steed, and welcome to another edition of Health IQ. We've got a great cast of what I would call influential characters who are not creating fake news. It is very important that you listen to what they have to say today because the truth will set you free, or in this case, save your life. And for many of us who have been locked up, those of us who are been confused, shared misinformation with our community, we hope you put on your intelligence mask when you listen to this Health IQ today. So with me, I will start to my left and my co-host, Dr. Kenyatta Stevens. Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
Great. How are you?
And then my favorite, and she has a huge wellness practice, truly empathetic to our experiences. And for those of you who don't understand it, there is a mental health pandemic going on in our community as we are working and being highlighted in the trauma going on during, prior, and for the last 400 years, we are now recognizing the particular systematic abuse to our people and to our culture. To help with that, we have Dr. Ray. Hello, everybody.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, you guys are going to lead the conversation. I am really here to listen. I say that, and Dr. Stevens laughs, but I think we're at a moment where we all need to trust the professionals. When you begin to start trusting yourself and not individual scientists, people who have dedicated their study to the circumstances that you didn't know that you were in until the doctor gave you your blood pressure. You didn't know that you were in until you looked at your family history and wondered why the blood pressure, the diabetes continued to come in your family, or you recognized that you felt unhappy at your job as everybody minimized you because you were lonely and you were the only Black person there. Or you're Black and you just don't have any power over your budget. Or you're Black and you're not certain you're Black because you're made to feel like if you don't agree with the general population that you're upset. Or you see African Americans looting and you feel like it's your financial health that's being attacked. And your friends, both Black and white, are going to judge you because you're being looted. But you shouldn't have any of these worries on your mind. You really need to understand your mental health and psychological and sociological health is at risk when you don't claim the victory that you are under siege. So there are the ground rules, and we just want to explain, and I brought together all of you to help. I want to ask Dr. Stevens first, where are we right now as it relates to the pandemic, and what do we really need to be doing? Because it's a whole lot going on. Our producer said she wants you to introduce yourselves. I thought I'd done that, but obviously not a good enough job. So Dr. Stevens.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kenyatta Stevens. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist and adjunct professor of public health and global health.
Dr. Legree.
Hello, I'm LaKesha Legree. I'm a general anesthesiologist in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I also have a wellness center that focuses on depression, PTSD, and suicidality in professionals, particularly in the African American community.
All right, Dr. Ray.
I'm Rashawn Ray. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland in College Park, and I'm a David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. I broadly do research on racial health disparities, as well as policing and the ways that we can use social policy to ameliorate structural racism.
All right. Once again, Dr. Stevens, if you could give us some insight on where we are and what our behavior really needs to be.
So right now, it's no secret that the minority community, especially Blacks, are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, this pandemic. And when you factor in the protests that have been happening and just the mindset of protesters and the community right now with everything that's going on, so that puts us in a place where we've kind of forgotten to social distance and wash our hands and wear masks, because fighting for racial equality is the most important thing right now. And so what that has put us in a place where we are dying 4 to 6 times higher than the rest of the population. And the other part to that is we don't even have a complete picture of just how greatly the Black community is affected by COVID-19. So that's where we are. We're at a place where we're protesting, we're fighting for racial equality. However, we've kind of put the pandemic on the back burner and we're still dying. So whether it's at the hands of police or is at the hands of COVID-19. So that's essentially where we are.
All right, we're going to come back to that. Depression, suicide, trauma, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery. The list goes on. Trayvon Martin, hanging people in both LA and New York, 2 largest communities. We all watched Knee on the Neck. We all got to see the video of Ahmaud Arbery. The whole community did. The world did, but we did. And then 2 shots to the back in Atlanta. How traumatized are we, Dr. Legree?
Honestly, just listening to you go over the names of the accounts, the different incidences that have happened already, just in the past, 6 months, because we're in June now. And this is just 50% of 1 year. So you compound that with years prior. And since 2015, really, when we talk about the Sandra Blands and when we talk about the Mr. Castillo, every 4 to 5 months, there was an incident where an unarmed Black male or Black female was killed, and it was captured and then subsequently live streamed or replayed on social media. So that's just a subset with respect to visualizing a murder, not a movie, not a murder mystery, not Law and Order, real life, and sometimes in real time. And so you compound that, and that becomes a secondary trauma. Every time you see something on social media, or every time you see it on mainstream media, that's a secondary trauma. So that, in combination with microaggressions that we commonly experience on an everyday basis, whether that's at work or whether that's in a grocery store, on top of, workplace issues, on top of perhaps just discrimination, such as what we saw with the bird watcher or the quote unquote Karen. So every single day, not only do we have to wake up and take care of the daily life activities or responsibilities, but we also have to endure sometimes unforeseen racism, whether it's outward aggression or outward communication by a white person. And then on top of that, now we're faced with having to physically watch and, according to some people in the majority population, be okay with seeing people in our race literally killed on TV. And I think a lot of us, because of our culture, we grow to be so resilient because we've gone through so much as a population that we tend to be too strong for our own good. And we don't recognize when we have signs of depression, such as irritability, lack of sleep or too much sleep, dietary changes, weight loss, weight gain, difficulty focusing, particularly when you are in a high functioning or a high demand profession, such as physicians or professors or business people or pharmacists. You know, you're taught to endure by training, and those are the people who say they're okay, but they really are not okay. It's so multifaceted and so many layers to peel back, really, like an onion.
Boom.
Yes.
Everybody jumps in the room. And then we come to policing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we ask, and I want you to take your mic off of mute, Dr. Ray, because I'm coming your way. You now have the trauma, the research, and then the denial of a society of what we're experiencing, not just now, but historically. Can you give us a view of ourselves that we typically don't see?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to thinking about policing and COVID, the way that I've been describing it is that we are dealing with two pandemics. We're dealing with one that hopefully we will eventually find a vaccine for. And of course, I mean, you all have been talking about that, and we could talk about the process for that. It's going to be a little bit longer than what people think, particularly what they've been saying in the media. But we also have been dealing with another pandemic that has always been with us, and that is structural racism. It's the fact that structural racism is baked into the founding of our country. We've never fully dealt with it. And policing is one of the ways that it's expressed. And so I think for a lot of people, I mean, when I look at 2020, I mean, we are just in June. I mean, we really aren't even halfway through the year yet. And I think about how bad does structural racism have to be? How bad does police brutality have to be for people to protest during a global pandemic that can kill them and that is disproportionately killing Black people? And so when we talk about policing, the reasons why people are in the street is because Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. Every 40 hours in the United States, a Black person is killed by police. Every 40 hours. And I've been publishing a series of articles at Brookings and other outlets to highlight the intersections between these sort of things. And I had a piece that came out last week with one of my colleagues, Dr. Sewell, who's at Emory University. And what we looked at are the collateral consequences of policing. What I mean by that is there are illness spillovers. So everything that we just heard about the manifestations of this moment that manifest in us mentally, physiologically, emotionally, physically, people have headaches, people have body aches. They really don't understand why. And I think the comment about what it feels like to be in corporate America or in any profession where you can't fully express that, I think is highlighted in my college roommate, Keith Jones, who is a banking executive. And we talked a couple of weeks ago and he said, the problem is that when I go to work, I can't act like my insides feel. And I think that's what's happening with Black people. And it comes out in two main outcomes. First, we did an analysis of neighborhoods that were more likely to experience police brutality. What we found was that men were more likely to experience mental health symptoms. They were more likely to be depressed, more likely to have higher rates of anxiety. And this is playing out more broadly throughout the country. Depression and anxiety has increased about 25% among Black people over the past couple of months, particularly over the past month, starting with Ahmaud Arbery and what happened with Breonna Taylor and others, and obviously George Floyd. And then, there is another part of it, and that's the fact that among women, part of what happens is that it manifests in women physically. They're more likely to have higher rates of obesity, higher rates of blood pressure, more likely to suffer from strokes, heart disease. This is controlling for everything under the sun. And what's doing that is the collective memory and contemporary pressures and strain of living under a police state.
Amen. I think the Dr. Stevens.
Yes, there are a lot of public health practitioners that have come to the conclusion that racism has led people of color, more so Black people, to be more exposed and less protected from COVID-19 and has burdened them with chronic diseases. So that's one of the main reasons that our outcomes are definitely poor. And then when you have to contend with managing your health and managing your life when you leave home, that creates a whole other just mental instability, if you will, because it's like, when I leave home, am I coming back?
Right. Just to piggyback off of what Dr. Ray and Dr. Kenyatta just spoke so eloquently about, with respect to COVID-19 and the worries and the uncertainties with that, particularly not knowing what to believe, whether it's the media or whether it's social media, or whether it's someone within your own family, you don't know what's true or not. And same thing with racial discrimination with what we're battling now, which, well, not now, but it's new to mainstream media, but this is not new to us, which is racial discrimination and the killing of unarmed Black Americans. And I think that the combination of the two is creating more incidences of post-traumatic stress disorder on top of incidences of anxiety and depression. And with respect to PTSD, that is something that so commonly is equated with war veterans or coming back from combat, when in fact, if you look up what the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder is, it simply says it's the result of either personally experiencing, personally witnessing, or secondarily having heard or witnessed any traumatic or scary event. It says nothing about the war, it says nothing about combat, just the witnessing or the experiencing of any traumatic or scary event. So if I think about that on a grand scheme, in my opinion, every single Black American has PTSD on some form of that spectrum, whether it's completely mild or whether it's completely severe. Either way, it's something for us to educate ourselves about, because if we don't know about it, then we can't recognize the signs within ourselves or within loved ones, and we can't get help for it. Right now, there are only about 9% of Black Americans within this country who are diagnosed with PTSD. But when you specifically look at Black males, approximately 54 to 75% of them either have the symptoms, know about it, but don't seek help, or they qualify, but they don't know that they have the symptoms, And so what happens is that our young Black men are raised to be strong, don't cry, suck it up, do what you have to do, put one foot in front of the other. And so we have to, as a community, embrace our Black men and let them know that not only is it okay for you to experience these emotions, but it's also okay for you to discuss these emotions. Right now, I think we're all on the same playing field within our community, irrespective of socioeconomic status, because we're all facing and seeing and experiencing the same things, irrespective of where you are socially or environmentally. But the thing that we all need to come together to do is, in addition to embracing each other, we need to talk to each other. Whether you're talking to a friend, a pastor, or a therapist, you need to get your emotions out. You need to acknowledge them, because what happens is you just continue to internalize them. They continue to become compartmentalized. And then one day you'll recognize that you have no more compartments left. You've run out of space to store anything. And that's when you hit the brick wall. And that's when you start talking about suicide. I mean, historically, people said, oh, we don't kill ourselves. No one in the Black community commits suicide. That is so far from the truth these days. And it's irrespective of socioeconomic status. In fact, in the last 2 years, 75% of suicidality amongst African Americans, suicidality has increased amongst African Americans by 75%. And that's within our youth, from teens to early 30s. So that's saying something. There's a reason that something is forcing our young people and our young adults to make a permanent solution for a temporary situation, suicide.
Absolutely. And I know that early on with the shelter in place, there were a number of suicides by teens who just couldn't bear the quarantine. And so when you have a society where you have a child essentially that would rather die than to be home. That speaks volumes, and that says something. So as a culture, as a race, that's something that we definitely need to address, and we need to just really reach out to our kids and help them, because studies have shown that just from this pandemic alone, the kids are the most affected with PTSD, and they're going to need a therapist. But again, being in a Black community, that's therapy. That's, you go to church or you pray. Like, that's the last thing that's really pushed or encouraged. And so after, well, I won't say after this pandemic, because we're going to be here a while, but I mean, right now is the time for any parents that are listening to just really take the time to talk to your children and like figure out what's going on with them, and possibly let them talk to someone other than you, or, a family member. So that's definitely important, and it needs to be stressed.
Dr. Ray, trauma, police, neighborhoods, the psychology of driving while Black in life.
As a male.
As a male.
As a male, yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's extremely traumatizing. I mean, I think it's several studies we can highlight, but it's one in particular that I always like to go to. It was a study that looked at telomeres. Telomeres are on the end of our cells. They tell us oftentimes how healthy we are, how fit we are, how long we might live. So we would expect that the younger you are, the longer your telomeres are. The longer they are, the healthier you are, the more bountiful you are. And what they found among Black male youth in low-income neighborhoods is that their telomeres were the length of elderly men. That is how stressed out they were. And to the points that we just heard, a lot of men and boys are going around putting on a masculine bravado because that's what we're socialized to do. And then I also think that it's a protective mechanism. It's oftentimes a survival mechanism to do that in certain neighborhoods. This spans whether or not you're in predominantly Black neighborhoods dealing with violence and crime, or if you're in a predominantly white neighborhood and you're dealing with criminalization and racism interpersonally in ways that's different from the type of interpersonal racism you might deal with in predominantly Black neighborhoods, or the structural racism you might deal with. So when I think about trauma, I mean, it's something that's a big deal. And we don't talk enough about healthy coping strategies, which is something, I mean, as the father of two boys, I mean, I think about all the time that, when you have little people who you're responsible for, I read something recently on social media that I thought was just so profound, and I think it applies to probably any parent, but I think you all will get the point. It said, when you have a Black boy, you pray differently. Uh-huh. And like, that really touched me deeply because I get it. You do. I mean, I have two boys. I mean, two little beautiful boys. They're very intelligent. They make straight A's in school. I'm going to take credit for this last quarantine homeschooling straight A's they made. But I mean, normally they do that at school anyway. But they're 16 months apart. And what's going to happen is they're going to instantly go from cute to criminal. How do you prepare kids for that? How do you go from the fact that they're cute right now, but the minute their shoe size increases 2 to 3 sizes, the minute all of a sudden their height peaks, the minute their bodies develop, which are things that you want to see in your kids, those are things that could expose them to more trauma. So when I think about it and studying this, I mean, it's difficult to even think about what I tell them. So it's a couple things how I think about it, a few ways. First big thing is I want them to develop healthy coping strategies. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You're going to experience racism. You're going to experience over-policing, and you're going to experience things that you don't think that you should, and it's going to be unfair. So how do you deal with that? So that's the first conversation. The second conversation is about the talk. We always talk about the talk, having a conversation with Black kids about interactions with the police. Well, as you all know, it's not really one talk. It's a series of conversations. So part of that means we have conversations over time, which leads to my third point, which is whatever my kids come to me with, if they're mature enough to ask a question, then that means they're mature enough to get a really thoughtful answer. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't always mean I have to have the answer right at that exact moment. Oftentimes I say, you know what, buddy, that was a phenomenal question. Let mommy and daddy talk about this and we'll talk back to you in a couple of days. And they're fine with that. So that I'm not saying anything off the fly that sounds crazy or I'm shaping them in any particular way. So waiting a couple of days, we come with research because that's what I do. I'm a researcher. My wife is a nurse practitioner, so she's coming with all this stuff. We have videos to show. We have worksheets to talk about. We sit down and have a conversation so that they can be prepared for these particular things. And I think the final point is all kids aren't the same. And I think one thing that particularly successful Black people have to recognize, because if any Black person is successful in any way in the United States, you are a remarkable person, like regardless of what anyone says. And the way I think about it is we reach true equality when a Black person, I think particularly a Black woman, can be average and still be successful. Like that, Black people can't be average and be successful. But the final point is kids are different. So even though my kids are 16 months apart, they like similar things, they have their own interests as well. But what might work for one might not work for the other. And part of what we have to do as parents is to instill in them healthy coping strategies, instill in them that, you know, it's okay to talk to someone beyond your parents. It's okay to seek out expert information, primarily psychologists and psychiatrists, if you're thinking about something mentally. And so these are kind of things that we have to change within our community.
Mhm. I think this is also a time for us to become extremely, extremely creative in these how and where we develop and roll out coping mechanisms and coping skills, because historically and even currently, you know, within the Black culture, the way we sort of cope is by being together, is by fellowshipping together, whether that is in church or whether that is in a kingdom hall or whether that is through sororities, fraternities, Jack and Jill links, you name it, we got it, but we can't do that now, right? And so what's the alternative? You still need to acknowledge and express those emotions. So I encourage parents to get creative. You know, you want to say, oh, do a virtual play day or do a virtual chat. Well, you also have to recognize that there are some children who live in certain low income areas who don't have Wi-Fi, let alone have a device to do a virtual chat on. So you know what? Go back to the old school. Pick up your cell phone. If you can only do 2-way or 3-way on the cell phone, get another friend on the phone. The point is interaction for your children. And then the second point is talk to them. Don't talk to them like they're babies. As he said, if they have an intelligent question and they're worthy of, and you have the responsibility to deliver a intelligent but truthful answer. Don't water it down, don't sugarcoat it, because when that day comes and they have that first experience of racial discrimination, and it can happen young. It happened to my daughter when she was 3 on the playground. So you have to talk to them at their maturation level in a way that they understand, but also in the way that they know how to respond and that they know how to act. With respect to those videos, I compiled a few videos that show how Black families, particularly mothers, have to talk to their Black sons, but also their Black daughters about what to expect and then how to react. And I also combined that with some signs and symptoms on how to recognize PTSD, depression, anxiety within yourself. You can find that on my website, www.drlegree.com. But it was shocking to me when I did the research, but it's very telling, and it gives you a lot of how-tos with respect to talking with your children, and really how to recognize within yourself what you might be feeling and experiencing. And don't just relate it to, oh, you know, it's another day that I have the blues, or, you know, some people say it's another day in the hood, where my brother, for example, we grew up in a low income area. You know, it was commonplace to lose a friend to gun violence. And within our community, you might view that as normal. That's not normal. Okay, that is not normal. So already our Black boys are growing up in what is a normal environment, but they're already suffering traumas before you even get to the whole racial discrimination and racial profiling and Black police, blackmail on police crime and all that stuff. So it's multi-layered, and we really have to do a better job with recognizing it early and then counteracting and interfacing with it early so that we can come to some solutions and diagnoses and be open to treatment early so that you don't hit the wall and have the suicide attempts. God forbid they're successful attempts.
Dr. Stevens?
Yes, and that brings to mind a video that surfaced yesterday, just right here in Metro Atlanta in Clayton County, where 5 boys were walking through a cut through, and they were roughhousing on the sidewalk in the grass, and a police officer pulled over and pulled out his gun. They were all probably under the age of 15. And he stood there with his gun pointed at them until backup arrived. And so, you know, with everything that's going on, so there were like people driving by that were videoing, just saying, these are kids. And they just kept, one woman in the video just kept screaming, these are kids, these are kids, these are kids. So when the backup came and, you know, they patted them down and then you send them on their way, but the trauma already happened. So how do you get past that? Because their parents weren't there. You know, do they even know what conversations to have with their children after something like that happens? And is that something that's going to happen more and more as we go along, because police are retaliating and it's apparent. So what do we do?
Dr. Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, with everything that's been said, I mean, I think that, I mean, there are a few things happening, right? I mean, part of it is what conversations we have with our kids. And then I think the other part of it is what do we do to change what we're seeing? So obviously today, Trump issued an executive order on police reform. The executive order actually has a series of positive things in it. I want to tell people why that's the case. The reason why that's the case is because most of the ideas in the executive order are things that people like Senator Cory Booker and others have been pushing for years. So just bear that in mind and don't kind of get confused on what's going on there. But I think one of the main changes that needs to happen and where people can really make change that's missing from that is the importance of restructuring civilian payouts for misconduct. So I think about what Dr. Stevens just said about these boys. And I reflect back on my own experiences, but it really bothers me to think about that could have been one of my boys playing, or both of my boys playing with their friends, had the gun put on them. Okay, what am I instantly going to do? Well, given the kind of work I do, I'm going to scale it up pretty quickly. But anybody could do that, file a formal complaint, sue the department, sue the officers. Okay, let's fast forward a couple years. A civil settlement has now been issued out, probably a small amount of money. No one was physically hurt, even though the mental trauma stays there. That would be the case. Say they get $25,000, $50,000, right? That money comes from taxpayer money in the county in Atlanta. All right. Let's talk large scale now. Let's talk George Floyd. Eventually, his family is going to get a large civil settlement. The same money that they paid in taxes is going to be the same money used to pay them back for the dehumanization and murder of their loved one. That should unnerve us all. In a city like Chicago, we're talking about over the past 2 decades, Chicago has paid out about $650 million in police misconduct, civil payments. As much as people talk about crime in Chicago, imagine if that money went to schools. Imagine if that money went to work infrastructure. Everyone knows that the reason, and really, if you look over the past few decades, crime has significantly decreased, particularly violent crime. But with that being said, everyone knows that you don't solve crime or prevent crime by throwing more cops on the street. Instead, you prevent crime by giving people equitable education and work opportunities, because then people don't feel the need to engage in crime in the same way that they do when they don't have those opportunities. So what I'm arguing for is a shift in civilian payouts for police misconduct away from taxpayer money in the general fund onto police department insurances. It becomes like a healthcare model. So people on here or know, will get that when you go to the hospital, that when Dr. Legree and others are doing what they do, then all of a sudden, of course, you have malpractice insurance if something goes wrong. And so what happens at that point, the hospital premium might increase. And if physicians and people who are doing surgeries mess up enough, the hospital will say, you can no longer perform surgery here. And in fact, we're going to refer you over to the medical board to have your license revoked. So these are the sort of changes that we can actually make that I think will go a long way. So people can contact their local, state, and federal representatives and tell them that this is something that needs to be done. It's dealing with what's called qualified immunity. And that's one of the big changes that needs to happen in law enforcement.
I like that idea, but I don't like it enough. For me, and I'm glad you're here so you can get this written up for me this week, Dr. Ray, I really believe that policy has to really inflict pain on the policymaker. At the end of the day, I think you were really close, but I don't want to insure the police for bad behavior. I want to actually have it inflicted on the pension of those individuals. See, because there's a bloody hood and a blue coat. And I've thought about this because obviously I live in Chicago. So I have some idea. But I think if all of a sudden that 650 was taken out of the pension of those individuals getting checks, you would have real impact. See, I don't want to reward you and pay for your insurance. I want you to have skin in the game. Because if it's not going to be skin in the game, Doc, you just talking policy. I'm a businessman. Why am I rewarding you for bad behavior and then paying for it with my house and mortgage? No, Mr. Police. And no, Mr. Politician. Y'all both now have skin in the game. Because now if you're wondering why that pension went down, it's because you killed and murdered some people that you could have just decided, let them go. I mean, I'm good on that. And so I think if we don't have policies that literally make the policymaker and the individual have skin in the game, we'll continue to get these ideas. We'll catch it up with some insurance. I want to ensure one thing, that our children grow up in a society where they got lost every time we got one. If they're not going to lose, they're going to win. They're going to get retirement. I don't want you to even be able to get enough. If you have one body on you, you should not be able to be employed in any government agency. If you got a body on you, no more employment as a security guard. You cannot protect anybody. See, because for us, we act like we don't get it. They get rewarded, they move. You shouldn't be able to be a government contractor after that. You shouldn't be able to go out of the country. Once you got a body, you should not have a passport. I mean,
see, that's one of the,
and that's how brothers describe it. He got 3 bodies. That guy got 20 bodies. I mean, who wants to hear that?
yeah. Well, see, this is one of the reasons why one of the things I've been pushing for is what you just said, is ensuring that officers who are terminated for police misconduct cannot work in law enforcement again, as well as police officers who are under investigation who resign at the time that a police misconduct allegation is in place, because that's the way bad apples proliferate. Now, and this is one of the pieces that I've written at Brookings highlighting what I'm talking about restructuring police misconduct claims, because this is what's key. So there are a lot of people who push for pensions. I think it's a lot of backing for that right now. I think it's a lot of support for that. One of my key issues is this: the pension, similar to people who talk about take it out of an individual officer's malpractice or liability insurance. It's not enough to remotely cover a life. So as you know, in Chicago, whether or not we're talking about Laquan McDonald and the over $6 million, Freddie Gray and the nearly $6 million, Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, $32 million, police officers' liability insurance won't cover that. Their pension won't cover that. So unless there is more money attached coming from somewhere, the amount of money for killing someone won't be sufficient. Now, it could argue that it's a combination of these things. And I think part of then dealing with that is dealing with the fraternal order of police, which is what I think is one of the biggest barriers to police reform.
Well, I like that. I'm not sure how much the annual pension is for these individuals, but let's put it on the table, Doc. We're counting on that. Facebook has a couple of comments, and they want to say thanks for helping them to understand from cute to criminal, which we know is a real issue. I think it's how you describe your boys. The other thing is, I think that for Facebook, you guys are telling the truth, and most people want facts versus fiction. But I do want to talk about this new trauma that we're having in understanding that we are being discriminated at all levels, and there is a friction between generations. Because when you saw individuals looting, we act like that was a surprise. We knew that there was a protest, and then we started to attack each other. Why did we attack each other, and why was our lens so negative against ourselves versus understanding that they took the trucks, backed them up to the treasury, got 20 and 30 million dollars for companies that didn't need it, but they never called them looters. And they politely asked them, will you bring it back? Mm-hmm. Now, I have not seen a note put up outside a place that was looted and say, would you politely bring back the $100 tennis shoes? You know, it is this type of trauma that we're experiencing. So I want to understand, why do we hate ourselves so much, Dr. Legree, that we attacked ourselves? And I don't know if any of you had that experience, but instead of having a lens of understanding about what the big picture was for this community that was traumatized by watching all of these things and the murder of their people.
Sure. Well, hate is such a strong word, and I want to believe at my core that we don't hate each other. I think what's happening is, depending upon the perspective, either it's misplacement of your emotions, or depending upon your perspective, or it's rightful actions that you take because of your emotions. I think what people are missing, particularly young people, is that you don't gain the attention of those who have the power to implement infrastructure changes through damaging infrastructures, through just sort of almost self-terrorizing our own neighborhoods. However, that is not to explain away the origin of the actions, which is basically they're pissed off. And, when you act out that way, particularly in a violent way, it's because you have exhausted all measures of trying to communicate your point of view, your experiences, your perspective. And at the end of the day, when you have talked, when you have presented, when you have kneeled, when you have done all that you could possibly do, that you have learned to do historically from the peaceful perspective, what is there left to do when you're not heard? So our young people are trying to seek the attention, but I think the way that they're going about it is not gaining the attention that is going to, depending upon the perspective, provoke infrastructure changes. And quite frankly, I am unsure what it's going to take, because you can change laws all day, but you have to change the hearts and the mentality of the majority, who are the ones basically holding people to those lawful standards. And that goes back to law enforcement, right? It's just so many layers, but I don't think we can fault our young people, and it goes also back to the education system. We have to stop with this fluffy historical education within the school infrastructure, such as MLK's birthday and Rosa Parks. No, nothing against MLK or Rosa Parks, but there's so much more to our history, And so if our young people have learned our historical figures, where we've come from, sort of, the things that we've endured, then they will see and understand that there's more than one way to solve a problem. And it's just not about sort of the immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction of what's going on now. But like I said, you can't fault them because they're pissed. Whereas an older generation, that's not how they were raised on the sit-ins. They were raised on the nonviolent marching. Well, if you look at that, I mean, the police force basically turned on us when we were on the March on Washington. You know what I mean? But yet now in 2020, they're looking at the young Black people who aren't really even the perpetuators of the violence, if you want to really pull the lens back. So it's so many layers.
Lots of layers, Dr. Stevens.
Yes, just to piggyback off of that, and that's it's a situation where you have a generation that has typically been coddled because their parents said, we don't want them to go through what we went through. And then when you fast forward to 2020, and they're faced with something that hasn't been inherently taught as they've grown. And so they don't know how to express themselves. So when you have an immature mind, so to speak, and I'm not saying that, they're children per se, but an undeveloped protesting mind is what I've been calling it. And I've done some calls where there have been teams that's like, what can we do and how can we do it effectively? And I was like, you have to strategize. But then you have that group that don't have any structure. So when a child doesn't know how to express themselves, what do? They tear things up. Mm-hmm. They destroy things. So we're dealing with like an immature Black history mindset because they don't know. And they think they're starting something new by saying like, oh, well, everybody else was passive. No, they weren't passive. There were dogs people sat in. We had bus boycotts and all those types of things. But they don't really know, the true history, like, Dr. Legree said. And so what do you do? So we have to start back, like start early. And that's some of the things that I've personally been working with others with here in Atlanta. And we're educating youth on racial history, civil rights, because that hasn't been taught. It's certainly not taught in schools. So when they are faced with something that they don't have a foundation for, or, just a natural understanding of, then that's what we get.
I think for coping, and I guess Dr. Legree, I wasn't just saying hate was part of it, but there's a lot of self-hate when we started judging each other. I mean, the comments were pretty cruel. I mean, all the way to they're animals. And I was like, well, who's somebody gonna reward you for saying that? Because it is very misplaced. Somebody has to pay you to say that because it is very misplaced. I think the lens of people that were older, like they're making us look bad. And I was like, who are they making look bad?
Right.
I'm like, well, who are you talking to?
Right.
And I had to remind people.
Survival instinct.
And I had to remind people it wasn't your moment. Like you got to remember that maybe you should be getting somebody out of jail.
Yeah.
Maybe you should be writing an op-ed. Your method of protest could be different, but don't starve them from the experience that they want to have based on what they've been traumatized by. This wasn't a gift.
Right.
This wasn't a gift. And I think we've got a question, Dr. Ray, about coping. And team, we got about 9 minutes. So someone asked a little bit about coping, and they wanted to know how they could actually cope. So if you would take 2 minutes, and then we're going to get to you, Dr. Legree, about coping, because I think we're all trying to cope in a pandemic and trying to make sense of what we see. Dr. Ray.
Well, I just want to quickly say something about the last conversation. I think one thing is that MLK talked about that a riot is the language of the unheard. And that's essentially what we're talking about. So even though MLK was for nonviolence, he very much understood the power of a riot. I think we also have to distinguish the difference between protesters, looters, and rioters. And if people actually go and look at what happened in Atlanta just this past weekend at the Wendy's, one of the first people who set fire to that Wendy's was actually a white woman. And so there are people on the left and the right engaging in agitation, oftentimes extremist groups. But I think when we talk about coping and we talk about young people today, we have to put it in context of where they're at. Most of them grew up under Obama. Their parents, Black, white, or otherwise, told them that we are now getting past racism, that Barack Obama is a representation of that. And as they come of age, particularly as they think about what happened in 2012, 2014, 2015, like Tamir Rice was said to graduate from high school this year. He will be going to college. That is their generation. So they're looking at us, their parents and grandparents, saying, you all told us we weren't going to deal with this. Not only did you tell us that we weren't going to deal with this, you all told us you had this handled and you failed. So because you failed, it's on us. And last time I checked with young people, they say, I'm not my ancestors, sincerely these hands.
Yeah.
And I think what they mean by that is you all didn't handle it. We're going to respond differently. And I think it's a slightly different narrative that we can also throw out here, which is, let's go back to 1968 when MLK was assassinated in the city where I went to college at a University of Memphis. And I vividly remember every year going down to the Lorraine Motel, starting at the slave auction block, going to the Lorraine Motel, and then riding back past a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that's no longer there. So as we talk about these changes, after MLK was assassinated and cities were burning around the country, you know what happened? Like less than a week later, Lyndon Johnson passed one of the most wide-sweeping civil rights legislations for fair housing. Y'all know what happened over the past couple of weeks? We got one of the most conservative, right-wing extremist presidents to issue an executive order to do a series of things: track bad officers, to collect data on police killings, to implement a series of funding for training and a host of things that we don't really have time to go into. But I think the point is that when we look at just these simple cases, Amy Cooper in New York City, she was fired and she lost her dog. Like, you know how big a deal it is to take dogs away from people, particularly white people's dogs. Like, I mean, we got to be serious about that. Second thing is there were 3 people in Georgia charged with murder. And Georgia, I just sat up and watched this morning, a Republican attorney general in the state of Georgia, where I grew up in Stone Mountain, talking about that they're about to pass a hate crime bill, which they've never had. Let's keep moving. Let's go up to Louisville. Police chief resigns. They just banned no-knock warrants. They're considering bringing charges for those officers, which would be unprecedented for no-knock warrants, by the way. And then let's go up to Minneapolis, where 4 officers were fired so quickly, they didn't even have a chance to resign. Now, I'm not saying that we are anywhere near any form of racial equality. What I am saying, though, is that those people in the streets tearing up stuff, that's the reason why people are reacting. And I think that young people kind of recognize that. And I think we have to recognize that some people cope through their ability to express their feelings that way. And part of what we have to do is give young people better coping strategies, which, even beyond thinking about policing and racism, I think one of the best ways that is a problem with our generation in raising kids is our kids don't have to win at everything. You know, it's one of those things where you can teach kids along the way healthy coping strategies to help deal with their emotions, to manage these particular things. And then I think also, what are ways that adults and kids can cope right now? I think as much as possible, we have to try to eat healthy. We have to exercise. We have to aim to think about what we put in our bodies, what we fuel it with. I think we also have to do a digest of how much negative energy and information we're bringing in when we turn on the news, when we pick up our phones. And I think simply because we are physically distanced from each other doesn't mean we have to be socially distanced. So we can be physically distant and socially connected. So in my household, for example, every week my kids have scheduled play dates with their grandparents. Their grandparents get on the phone, they do FaceTime, they do Zoom. They're setting up drawing things on the phone. They're having little classes. So even though all of us would love to see their grandparents, my mom and my mother-in-law, obviously we can't do that right now, but there are things that we can do. And I really think that during this time, as people are eating a lot of bread and people are drinking alcohol and all of this, these are coping strategies that are oftentimes going to have negative implications for us. And we need to try to shift them a bit more positive.
All right, I would have you repeat that, Dr. Ray, but not tonight, because it was an amen moment. Hallelujah for all those who didn't hear it, but we'll play it back for them. We got 4 minutes for each of you ladies. Dr. Legree.
I'll just say, three main points. With respect to coping mechanisms, I think that's been the conversation across the board. But I like to go a step further and say that treatment is imperative. Although coping mechanisms are part of therapy, we are undiagnosed. We are underdiagnosed. So with respect to anxiety, with respect to depression, with respect to PTSD, yes, coping mechanisms are awesome and we need to learn them and we need to put them at play, but treatment is really what needs to happen, whether that's in the form of oral antidepressants, whether that's in the form of oral anti-anxiety medications, which be careful with those because those can turn into a negative coping mechanism as well with respect to addiction, or whether it's something alternative such as ketamine, which is what my clinic produces, that works in 2 weeks. We need to guard our minds. That's what I always say, guard your mind. That thing that we grew up saying and learning, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Some of our young kids, honestly, surprisingly, have never heard that. And so we have to get back instilling with them that if you guard your mind, then you can basically strategize and mobilize and execute whatever plan that comes to play, such as Killer Mike was saying in his conference the other day. We have to get back to guarding your mind, and that goes with nutrition as well. You have to make sure that you intake what's necessary so that your mind can thrive, can continue to process things accordingly. And then once those treatments, oral in terms of medication or intravenous, in addition to the nutrition that you choose to put in your body collectively, will help you get to a point where you're even willing to hear about the coping mechanisms and then actually do whatever those coping mechanisms are. Because keep in mind, a lot of coping mechanisms deal with talking. Our young kids, they don't want to talk right now.
All right.
They're mad, they're angry.
You've got all of the big men.
So I just, basically just want to point out and just reiterate to our viewers that health is more than just physical. Health is mental, health is emotional, and health is social. And so while most of the attention is pretty much put on our physical health, we have to also take care of our emotional, mental, and social health as well. Because what we're seeing right now is that discrimination is shaping the way that Black people are suffering during this pandemic. And so we have to attack that, not just with our physical health, but with our emotional health, with our mental health, and, social health, and even spiritual as well. And so, talk to somebody, parents, to understand how you can help your children, because your children they're not talkers.
Well, I want to thank you all, Dr. Legree, Dr. Stevens, Dr. Ray, for coming to Health IQ. We got to circle back before the summer ends again. We didn't get to touch on the economic racism that is happening, which is actually devoid of the conversation, which Dr. Ray, I really want to push you, and I mean push in a brotherly way, so we can get over this hill from an intellectual construct on the children aren't going to achieve as much right now. It's a pandemic, fewer internships. So that whole Obama myth of becoming, not shade on the book, but it's just going to be a very tough moment unless we start policing the economic discrimination that is in corporate America. There are too many dreams deferred. There are no KPIs on corporations, and their hiring practices are minuscule, and they are sprinkling money to nonprofits versus hiring and doing business with Black people and businesses. So I want to thank you all and say this is Munson Steve from Rolling Out Health IQ. We're coming back with the Rolling Out News Report, but I really want to thank you all for a great evening. Dr. Stevens, goodbye.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you. I got another 2 hours. And Dr. Legree, you are always best. I feel like I was in treatment right now. I probably need a little telemedicine, given that I've been here for so long. But treatment will make our community better. I do think that we have to begin to get treatment because so many people have been traumatized. So if you find yourself traumatized or anything else, please, please, please seek treatment and increase your health IQ. I'm Munson Steve from Rolling Out. Peace.
Bye.